If we're talking about emotionally salient kinds of information from the body, we're going to be talking about tissue damage, for example. That's called the detection of tissue damage is nociception. Specialized nociceptors. These are specialized neurons, that have kind of endings here. They express receptor proteins that are in the membranes here that can grab onto or bind the proteins that are released actually when your own cells, are cut or crushed or damaged. They spill out their contents, and the detection of those spilled contents is nociception. It's the detection of injury, and that's pretty salient. I mean, like that kind of information, causes you to do all sorts of things, like to orient to something. Like what is that? To basically alert, be more awake. Also to pull away, right? To reflexively withdraw. So it turns out that these cells don't go as far in terms of their length as the tactile, and proprioceptive mechanoreceptors. That kind of information you want to get up to the brainstem and then, into the parietal lobe as quickly as possible, so you can integrate, what you're touching and where your body is positioned with visual information, and also what we call vestibular information about balance and acceleration. While this kind of information, the emotionally salient stuff, the neurons are going to stop in the spinal cord, and they're going to be involved in reflexive, for example, withdrawal responses from injury. And these again, there are different sources for this emotionally salient kind of somatosensory input. It's going to be the nociceptors, which detect injury, tissue damage. What they call thermoreceptors, which detect like temperature, like very hot or very cold, for example. Itch-sensitive neurons too, because if you feel something itching you, before you even really it gets to the brain, you often scratched it or knocked it away if it's a bug or a mosquito or something that's landed on you. And also there are some kinds of touch receptors that are actually involved in sort of more sensual touch or more kind of massage kind of touch and things like that. And that will also travel in this particular network in the brain. It often can produce specific sort of reflexive, spinally mediated, kinds of reflexes. So this information is going to come from the body. It's also somatosensory. It's going to also come, through the nerve root, what we call the dorsal root. It'll also have, a cell body. This is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. It'll have a cell body in the dorsal root called dorsal root ganglion. And then its, axon effectively will go in and make a synaptic connection right there in the spinal cord. And that can be, part of a reflexive withdrawal response, for example. But then it will also make synaptic connection with another neuron in this network that's carrying this emotionally significant or salient somatosensory information to the brain. And that neuron will send its axon, sort of across basically the spinal cord to the other side, what we call the contralateral side of the body. So remember, everything somatosensory starts on this side, it'll get to this side of the brain. This is happening at the level of the spinal cord with this emotionally salient stuff. It'll rise up, more towards the front of the spinal cord and to the side of the spinal cord. And neuroanatomists use, fancy terms for front is, towards the anterior portion, and side, it means lateral. So these cables are all rising up in what we call the anterolateral. That's the front side white matter or, axons basically of the somatosensory, of the spinal cord. And they're going to make then synaptic connections in the brainstem. And they go to a couple places in the brainstem. Typically they go to, areas that allow you to orient, to look at what just happened, right? To sort of swivel your head, neck, and eyes around. This is, very stereotype reflexive. You get injured here, at the spinal level, you withdraw. And then at the brainstem level, you look, right? And it also provokes significant kind of arousal, like it wakes you up. Like if you, pinch yourself, you're doing tissue damage, you're setting off some nociceptors, you're getting, transit up this anterolateral system, and in the brainstem, it'll alert you and get you more aware. And then ultimately, most of the information, there's some that goes elsewhere, but most of the information is going to be arriving and being mapped in a deep lobe, sort of within that big lateral fissure in the, the side of the brain that separates the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe and the temporal. There's a big kind of, it's called the lateral side fissure. Deep inside there is something called the insular lobe. And the insular lobe is going to significantly map, all of that, injury information, all of that temperature information, all of that itch information, all of that central touch information. And that's really an emotionally significant region of your brain that links into the frontal lobe, so you can feel and make decisions about things, based upon how you're sort of feeling. So just to summarize, somatosensation is much more than Aristotle's touch, right? It involves not only touch, tactile, pressure, stretch, grip, like all of these kinds of, proprioception, that are being detected by very specialized neurons, right? And then carried up to the brain along the spinal cord at the back in what we call the dorsal columns, right? And ending up ultimately after, thalamus in the parietal lobes. That's for mechanoreceptive, proprioceptive aspects of somatosensation. That's more what Aristotle was in some ways thinking when he mentioned touch, potentially. While, emotionally salient information, information about tissue damage, injury, itch, temperature, all those kinds of emotionally significant aspects are going to actually rise up in the more anterior and lateral, so front and side portions of the cord. They're going to come from different receptors, obviously, too, right? They're going to synapse at more places, right? Because they require reflexive responses from the spinal cord, and also orienting responses and alerting responses at the brainstem. And ultimately, that kind of emotionally salient information traveling up the anterolateral system will end up in the insular lobe primarily, not the parietal lobe. So ultimately, we put the whole body back together. A lot of that actually happens, it turns out, in the insular lobe. But the initial arrival sites for mechanoreception, parietal lobe, and for emotionally salient information in the insula.